Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In the Nick of Time. And we're going to get started in about 6 minutes with Dan Lorenc joining us to debunk software supply chain. So stay tuned. He's the founder of MiniCube and Scaffold and a project like Sigstore and Distroless, former Google. It's going to be a very interesting discussion. So let's get started in about 5 minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In the Nick of Time. This is so exciting. Today we have Dan Lorenc, the CEO of ChainGuard and founder of MiniCube, Scaffold, Sigstore and Distroless, and so many great projects with the open source community. So it's going to be an exciting discussion to debunk software supply chain. So with that, if you've not yet subscribed to the show, do that in the nickofTime.tv. You're only going to get an email a week for our next episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about the future of digital engineering and modeling and simulation with digital twin. And so that's going to be a very interesting discussion also on how to know how your system is going to behave before even bending metal. So that's going to be fun. So don't miss that out next Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern, as always. If you've not tried yet the Dear Ask Sage, go try it now. We're bringing GPT to the government and supporting CUI for UO content. So we can ingest more content. We can create personas, different type of use cases from contracting officers to developers to legal to whatever. A lot of excitement. We can create decision trees, go no go flying decision, tapping into data lakes, databases. So so much to do. We have 1,000 teams now on Sage in 6 weeks, which is pretty amazing. So go check it out. We have a new monthly plan now for only $30 per month, and we just released a new coupon code just for this week. So if you want to give it a shot, we have a $5 off the subscription forever for the first 1,000 users. So go try that out. Let's Beat China is a coupon code that you want to use to get that $5 off, as always. So $25 a month, very cheap. 500,000 tokens. You can also train up to 100,000 tokens per month with custom data as well. Like I said, all the way up to CUI. So with that, hopefully you give us feedback, and we have a Discord chat. So you'll see the link when you create an account. You can join us on Discord and come ask questions or share your feedback. We always love to know what to improve, and you've seen already a lot of improvements in the last 5 weeks. So that's pretty exciting. As we talked about, we have a special guest today. Dan Lorenc is the founder and CEO of ChainGuard, a leading software supply chain security company. Dan has been working on and worrying, like me, about containers since 2015 as an engineer and manager. He started so many open source projects, very impressive career with Minikube, Scaffold, Canico, to make obviously containers easier and funnier. I don't know if it's easy and fun just yet, but at least it's getting there. And of course, like me, is also very much worried about the state of open source supply chain, and so he partnered with Kim and others and created the Tecton and Sigstore project to be able to bring containers to life more securely with baked-in security and not bolted-on security. That's obviously essential, as well as Salsa to create this common language for software security and supply chain integrity. He's been involved with the CNCF and chaired the Continuous Delivery Foundation Technical Oversight Committee, and he sits on the governing board and technical advisory committee of the Open Source Security Foundation. You can follow him on Twitter, Dan Lorenc, and he's on LinkedIn as well. Great follow if you want to keep up with what's happening, particularly, of course, with the supply chain and all the stuff that's been happening since the President Executive Order pushing SBOM to the federal government agencies, which obviously the Open Source Security Foundation has been an essential part of. So that's been moving to the right direction. Now, of course, we have to bring it home. So with that, let's welcome Dan. Welcome.
Wow, that was quite the intro. Thanks for having me today, Nick.
Well, you're who you are, so it's not hard for me to do a good job when we have guests like you. So we're lucky to have you. So much to talk about today. When we prepped this show, I was concerned because we have so much to talk about, but yet everything is interesting. So we could have you for maybe 10 months and still be talking about stuff. So before we get started, we always have the same engagement with the guests. So I want to know a little bit about your journey with your own words, because with my French accent, it's never good enough. So over to you.
I'll translate. Yeah, thanks for the intro, Nick. I've been in the open source dev tool space for a long time. Before that, I was at Google working on internal production infrastructure. I was at Google for about 8 or 9 years before starting this company, ChainGuard. And when I started at Google, I was mostly working on internal security. And Google has some of the best in class, world class production and supply chain security systems in place because they were hit early on with kind of a wave of nation state attacks, Operation Aurora, a bunch of those other things that have come out now in that 2010, 2011, 2012 timeframe when a lot of the cloud hyperscalers were. So I got to watch Google build out a really hardened internal system as a result of not being able to trust internal developers at that scale. Then when I started working in cloud and containers in that Kubernetes space, I put my first couple projects up on GitHub, got ready to do some of the releases, and looked around and asked people what to do. And I was told basically go buy a Mac Mini, throw it under your desk at work, install Jenkins on it, and then use that. That's the right way to ship software in open source. And frankly, that was terrifying. I was producing, some of the most widely used projects in the Kubernetes ecosystem, and folks were just kind of taking those, downloading them, running them as root on their laptops, and calling it a day. So I felt pretty worried about that. I felt a lot of responsibility to make sure the code I was building was correct, was secure, and was securely produced. And it just kind of led me down this long rabbit hole of investigating different open source projects and solutions in the space to be able to do that more securely, to resemble, really hardened software factory, as that term has come up lately. Early on, there wasn't much going on in that space. I felt like a lot of a lot of the time we were bothering people in open source, getting them to care about these things, getting them to sign builds, publish hashes, the original SBOM concept, until around 2020 when the big breach on SolarWinds happened that I'm sure everyone here is aware of. That was kind of a light bulb moment for most of the industry. People realized that build system security, CI/CD pipeline security are as critical as application security itself. If you're not securing those build systems and operating them in at least as secure of a manner as the environments they're deploying into, it's kind of like building this giant, massive electric fence, but then leaving the door unlocked and letting people just walk right in. So it's great to see renewed focus on this space. And that's what led me to start the company ChainGuard, where we're doing a bunch of things in the container space, both open source and in our products to help improve and push the industry forward. So
Yeah, no
that was
doubt.
a short version.
No, that's awesome. And what's interesting is I don't know why you would be worried of putting a laptop under your desk to build stuff. I don't know what's wrong with you, but just funny enough, it's pretty mind-boggling when you start digging into open source projects and access control, who has access to expiring accounts. Now we've seen a few breaches, right, with email domain expiring and people stealing the domains to be able to get access to projects. I mean, there's so much going on. It's I think people are starting to wake up, like you said, and it's good. It might still not be good enough, but it's getting there. But when we start looking at some of the work you started doing, initially you started with this Minikube project that pretty much everybody playing with Kubernetes has had the chance to play with. So what was your main goal behind Minikube?
Yeah, good question. The world back then was so different. Kubernetes was still new. There were kind of wars with Docker Swarm and Mesos and all of these other orchestration platforms, but Kubernetes was gaining a lot of momentum. One of the big friction points back then, a lot of cloud providers didn't have full support for Kubernetes. There were no free trials. It was pretty expensive to actually get something up and running. And there was no way to just get a cluster going on your laptop unless you were an actual core developer of the Kubernetes project and had a whole dedicated Linux machine with virtual machines and everything set up. But I thought, well, everyone's going to be developing for Kubernetes eventually. Maybe we should just build an easy way to do that on your laptop. So that was how the idea for Minikube came up. There's a fun fact. The very first name, what we wanted to name the project early on, was actually NanoCube. But some of the folks said, well, it's not that small yet. It's still a couple hundred megabytes at a minimum. So it's a little too aspirational. So we increased it from NanoCube to MiniCube.
Yeah, I wouldn't go nano just yet. You're
Maybe someday.
not too far, but it's I mean, compared to what you had to do to deploy it before that, obviously a massive improvement. But yeah, I don't know if there's really a micro or something like that small when it comes to Kubernetes. Even when we put it on IoT, and Jets and Bombers, with K3s and all these allegedly smaller distro, is still a pretty heavy beast, right? Particularly when you start adding all the logging, telemetry, all the stuff you need to run something like this. So it's always interesting. Well, thank you for the contribution. We all use it, so you've done a good job. Um, when I introduced you, we talked a little bit about Salsa, and not many people know what Salsa is. So maybe give us a rundown on what's the goal behind it, and why you decided to do this.
Sure. Supply chain security can be an overwhelming space. There's a lot of concepts, too much to learn. And I mean, this happens all too much in security. But when faced with something massive and overwhelming like this, we poke holes in all the arguments. Like, why would I fix that when that still leaves this other threat vector open? And it can kind of lead to this feeling of hopelessness in a lot of cases, unfortunately. The Salsa project was designed as a way to try to make that process incremental and clear and easy to talk about exactly where you are. You don't need to secure everything in your recursive transitive dependency tree to still make an improvement. And so to combat a lot of that hopelessness, the overwhelming nature of the space, myself and a bunch of folks put together the Salsa Framework. So it stands for, I'm always so bad at acronyms, but I'm pretty sure it stands for Security Levels for Software Artifacts. There's 4 levels. It was based off of a similar internal framework at Google. Um, there's been a paper published about that one. So, the white paper is called Binary Authorization for Borg. But that system also had 4 levels, and there are a lot of controls in place so that software that needs to run in the most trusted, most secured fashion with access to the most sensitive information had to be at the highest levels, while other software that was not as sensitive, hobby projects, toys that people were deploying, could be down at those lower levels to reduce friction and really focus investment on the most critical software. So Salsa is designed similarly. There are 4 levels. Salsa 1 is basically the bare minimum. That means you have some record somewhere of how a software artifact was produced. You might know, like, you can kind of think of it as just writing down the name of the build system or something like that. So you can begin to trace an artifact back. Very, very simple, incremental progress. It's still better than a lot of the software out there today, though. It's designed to be easy to get started with. And it goes up through level 4, where it's fully hermetic, reproducible builds run in air-gapped environments with no access to the network, all the dependencies mirrored, scanned, cryptographically signed and verified, all of that stuff. And a lot of organizations, it's resonating with them. So they like the incremental approach. They like being able to clearly communicate what level we're at, what level we want to get to, what are those next steps. It's not opinionated in how to do it. So there's a lot. The community's been providing a lot of best practices and frameworks and tools and starter GitHub repositories to get you started on the right track, which has been great to see.
Yeah, the level 4 is a pretty high bar. I mean, you would argue everybody doing meaningful software should be there, but the dependencies makes it pretty difficult, right? Because effectively, either you have to rebuild everything, and then you have to of course sign it and have the hashes.
Yeah,
But then if you
hard
have
work.
dependencies, right, from third parties, you're stuck with whatever it is they do, right? So many don't have that maturity yet. So would you argue, when you look at dependencies for your projects, you pay attention to how they manage their builds, and that's a kind of a primary factor or secondary factor to pick between options of libraries and different modules that you guys end up using?
Yeah, it's a really subtle topic that I think gets glanced over a lot, especially in open source. People think of open source as the source code. You can find it on GitHub. You can review all of that. There's Linus Torvalds' famous law of all bugs are shallow given enough eyes. And that's technically correct, but there's a bunch of challenges with that. We're not all looking at the right stuff. The dependency trees get too huge. Um, the second part, though, that everyone kind of misses, assuming you do review and audit all of that source code, is that in most consumption models, you're not actually consuming the source code. You're consuming a package which has been built in some
Right.
fashion. When you run, yeah, you might completely audit the requests library in Python, for example. But then when you run pip install requests, you're actually getting a zip file that someone uploaded into PyPy, and there's no guarantee that there's any relationship between the code in that package and the code that you reviewed on GitHub. That step of doing that build securely and tracing the provenance is glanced over a lot. If you're an organization that cares a lot about security, then you're probably grabbing that source code and building it from source yourself rather than relying on that package manager, because that step is so opaque. But if you do want to be able to consume these binaries in the same fashion, then yeah, you do have to pay attention to how these things are built. And we're starting to see open source projects take this seriously too. The Kubernetes project has been one of the leaders in this space, pushing their builds. I think they're at Salsa 2 now and getting very close to all of the requirements for Salsa 3. The CNCF as a whole has been great here, even funding audits and work on projects and starting to set requirements that projects, as they move up through the tiers, have to be building and releasing their artifacts with certain Salsa levels.
Yeah, but yeah, they are not using Salsa yet to define. Okay, you cannot get to a mature project if you're not at least 2 or 3. I would
Not
argue that
yet.
should be probably a mandate, right? So they need to step up the game there and put a little bit more pressure. I think it's just for even the leading project being Kubernetes still being stuck at number 2, you would argue that's probably not good enough. So
Yeah,
they
we need
need
to
to
make
step
it
up,
easier for everyone.
right? And part of that, right, was your work with Sigstore and so for people that don't know what Sigstore is, can you tell us a little bit about what's the goal behind Sigstore?
Yeah, this is the whole journey we're walking through. When putting the Salsa framework together, when working on a lot of these secure build tools and other projects like Tecton and Canico and Distroless, it became very clear that cryptographic signing, especially in the context of open source, was really hard, and that was a huge friction point, which led to people not doing it. There have been a bunch of cryptographic signature solutions around for decades. They're not new. There's PGP and that whole GPG ecosystem that's been around forever. But the friction there is just too high. I don't know if you've ever tried to get a GPG key signed, but it relies on this kind of web of trust where a lot of the original key signatures were done at in-person parties where you would meet, you would check people's ID, you would sign all of their keys to attest that you had met them and they really were who they said they were. And those aren't really happening anymore. And especially during the pandemic era, a lot of open source projects that were trying to do that struggled when they couldn't meet people in person, check their IDs. Outside of that, in the commercial space, there's kind of a whole separate ecosystem around cryptographic signing. There's these certificate authorities that you can send some money to. They might ask you to fax them some business letterhead or something to prove you are who you say you are, and then they send you back a code signing certificate. These things are good for several years. They're a couple $100. The CAs can be sometimes sketchy when they hand them to you. If you lose one, you're out of luck. If you get it compromised, you're out of luck. Revocation is a big mess. So there's no clear answer, especially for open source projects where you can't afford or you might not even have a business entity set up to go get one of those certificates. So after analyzing all of that, that's how we put together some of the original designs for the Sigstore project. If you look at what happened with web encryption over the last decade, like TLS and certificates in browsers, it shot up from basically all the stats I've seen said around 40 to 50% of internet traffic was encrypted about a decade ago. And that number is above 99% now. It's very, very, very rare that you see a website without that little shield icon at the top. And in fact, most browsers won't even load them at all now. For decades, you could always bypass that security. And now it's so ubiquitous that you can just assume it's there. And the big motivating factor there, I think, was the Let's Encrypt project. The Let's Encrypt project set up automation and a free public betterment service to offer certificates for free. So they made it easy, they made it free, and they did that through hard work and new standards. And because of that, everyone is now able to get certificates. We try to do the same thing with Sigstore. So the Sigstore project runs a free certificate authority for open source. Anyone can get one. You download some of the tools, run a command. Your browser window pops open. You verify you are who you say you are by doing an OpenID Connect authentication. So it's like that little login with Google, login with GitHub, login with Microsoft button that you see on most websites. And then you get a certificate you can use to sign your code tied to that email address. So this integrates great with most open source workflows, and we're seeing huge adoption, just like with Let's Encrypt, because it's free, it's easy, and the community runs a service to help keep it stable and up for everyone.
Yeah, that's effectively streamlining and removing all the bottlenecks, right? And Let's Encrypt obviously started to do that with the TLS certificates. But then I was always surprised, right? Because it's almost funny. I don't know how to explain it better than the cloud native guys maybe were younger generations, and it seems like they forgot all the best practices we learned the hard way before cloud native stuff. And you look at even Windows installers, they have to sign the MSIs, right?
Yes.
It's So it's almost like we went backwards, right? When we and having to relearn. Oh, we need maybe something like web application firewall. What do we need for ingress, egress? What do we do there, right? It's almost like, oh, we have to reinvent the internet and all the stuff we knew how to do for 20 years. That's always interesting how security seems to slip
Yes.
with new innovations, right?
Yeah,
But
I mean, no
Sigstore
one wants to
obviously,
do things wrong. Like you said,
of course,
streamlining it, making it easy, making it free. Developers will use it. They don't want to be insecure. They just don't want to have to go out of their way.
right. But how much do they actually know, right? I feel like there's a new generation of developers, and the training I think on security was really not up to par, and I feel like there was a whole new generation of developers with very little understanding of security, both basic things like XSS, SQL injections, but also like the stuff we just talked about. I feel like that there was a learning or training issue. I don't know. I don't know if you've seen it with people add it after the fact. It's not baked in. It's kind of an afterthought. But I guess it was already like that before. I guess, but
Yeah, yeah. I mean, training, especially in the context of secure software development, is hugely important. And there's only so much tools can do for you. I do think it's important to bake as much of this into tooling as you can, so developers don't have to learn and don't have to make mistakes. But you're always writing application code. No tool is ever going to be able to, perfectly secure your business logic. But we do see entire classes of bugs and vulnerabilities get wiped out by security technology, which is great. One big
right,
example there is memory safety. You know,
right,
C programming has been taught in universities forever, and off by one errors and memory management are taught. And it's just one of those things that after 30 years of trying to teach people how to manage memory and C correctly, we still make mistakes. And some of the most sensitive code in the world is written in the C programming language, and memory safety issues come up constantly. Now that we have technologies like new programming languages that don't allow those bugs, then we don't have to keep yelling at students. We don't have to keep telling people they're doing their job incorrectly. We can just take advantage of these new technologies. We're starting to see that
right,
too with the Rust programming language being used in the Linux
right.
kernel. That's going to be huge for the security of everyone.
Right. Yeah, we even start to see it in weapon systems as well, so that's pretty exciting.
That's very exciting.
I guess, yeah, I guess there's a little breaking news here. A Russian jet just collided with a U.S. drone over the Black Sea. So
Oh
wanted to
wow,
share that with the group. Yeah. So interesting.
I
Hopefully
was
that's not gonna.
expecting I was expecting breaking news to be about the banking crisis going on right now. But
I know. Yeah, that's a
interesting
different time.
times.
Yes. All right, so we talk about Sigstore. Now let's look into, okay, so attack surface. Obviously, you want to reduce, minimize it. There's a lot of bloated bits, right? A lot of dependencies that come with some of the artifacts we install that you don't really need in production, right? So kind of having multi-stages containers was a great step to remove the stuff you don't need, right? With Go and other things, that was also very much streamlined. But then you guys came up with this distroless thing, but is it really distroless anyway? I think it's well, it sounds like all the function as a service and serverless nonsense, which is obviously there's a bunch of servers. So are you lying to us again, or what's going on?
Yeah, I always say the best names are the ones people complain about because they're at least talking about it and paying attention. So that's definitely true with the distroless name. The distroless project was another project myself and some of my co-founders put together years and years ago at Google. When we were starting to run containers for Google services, the very first thing you do when you have a container is you scan it because everyone does that when they want to be secure. And anybody that's scanned containers sees that it's just a mess. You could take a random Debian or Ubuntu or Red Hat or any container out there off of Docker Hub, scan it, and you're gonna find hundreds or thousands of, I'm going to put it in air quotes, vulnerabilities in that container from
Right,
those scanners. There's a huge problem with noise in the entire vulnerability management ecosystem. But the easiest way to get that under control is to remove the stuff you don't need. There's a lot of benefits to that, like you said, reducing attack surface, stripping things down, making them smaller. But the really biggest benefit, at least in my opinion, is less noise to deal with from the scanners. I've seen a lot of stats saying only 4% of the vulnerabilities and CVEs reported by these scanners are actually exploitable. And that's a really comforting number, except to put it in perspective, when you have hundreds or thousands of vulnerabilities coming out, 4% of that is still a pretty large number. And I'd much rather have a world where you're sifting through 1, 2, 3, or 4 vulnerabilities and you have a really high signal uh, ratio there, rather than have to sift through thousands. It leads to that kind of broken window effect where everything is broken all the time. You're not actually looking at the scan results. You're not triaging each individual one, which means that when the 1001st one pops up, you might not look at it, but that one could be the one that actually does get you. So the original Distroless project was a way to build containers that had only the packages that you needed to run your application. This was done using Bazel, and it was based on the Debian distro. So definitely not distroless, but if you strip out enough stuff, then it's kind of this existential question around how many things from a distro do you have to keep in there to actually qualify as that distro. Plus, it was a cool name, and it piggybacks on that serverless buzzword, like you said. The approach resonated. We saw a lot of open source projects adopt it because they're sick of dealing with this too. If you run an open source project for long enough, you'll see users start filing bugs saying scanners are reporting vulnerabilities, and it might not be anything you can actually deal with. So lots of open source projects base their images on these distroless ones. But at the end of the day, it's just kind of a repackaged version of Debian Packages, the original distroless project.
So just to clarify, right? When you run distroless, are you effectively running the base OS of the Kubernetes node, or how do you inherit
It
those, or is it
depends.
right?
Yeah, it depends. So the typical distros container, like let's say for Java, has the JVM, only the library is needed to power that JVM, and then you throw your application in there. So you're not really inheriting stuff from the base OS. Really, what you're inheriting is the kernel. So anything that the kernel provides.
Right,
But that's set up anyway. That's just how containers work. But a lot of
right.
Linux distributions, the name there, Linux distribution, means you're distributing Linux. Linux
Right.
itself is really just the kernel. And so when you have a container that has everything except for Linux inside of it, it's kind of like the opposite of a Linux distribution at the end of the day. So undistro, we use that term too, distroless, a Linux distro without the Linux. It is kind of a confusing um, way that we're shipping software today.
And when you run distroless, the packages of like the Java package, for example, where is that coming from?
Um, so you mean the package of Java itself, like the
Yeah, yeah.
JVM, or like I say a Java package written in Java?
No, the JVM
Yeah,
itself.
sure. And yeah, so this is also some of the confusion. But distroless used to refer to a very specific project, github.com/Google Container Tools/distroless. Now it's kind of turned into an adjective or a category or something. A lot of other vendors are shipping distroless style containers where they rip stuff out. In the original distroless project, that one under Google, the original Java package came from Debian, who takes it and they do the builds, the Debian maintainers, and they repackage it from Adopt OpenJDK or I can never remember the name, Turnium, something like that, is the original
Right.
OpenJDK vendor. They package the source code, Debian builds that themselves and throws it into a Debian package, and then the distroless container gets that. So you're already seeing a lot of hops in that supply chain, a lot of room for something to go wrong.
Right. And so when you get those Debian packages, does that mean you have to have the Debian package manager stuff a part of this stuff as well?
Yeah, so that was the one, I guess, one of the first innovations of the original distroless work. We wrote a new build system in Bazel that was able to grab those Debian packages and compose them into an image without the Debian package manager itself. So you didn't have to leave that in there. You didn't have to have a shell. It was declarative. You could just say, I need OpenSSL, Bash, and curl, and you could unpack those directly into a container image without the package manager. Exactly what you
Mm.
need. Over
And what
time, though,
if
all
you
these
needed a couple of what happens if you need more packages?
Yeah, it was hard to scale. The original distroless effort doesn't have too many. There's a bunch for basic programming languages, and that's kind of it. You can add new ones if you want to write Bazel rules yourself to grab new ones from Debian.
That can be
Um,
easy, right?
no, it's not easy. It's not fun. We've started. So yeah, we've started. I mean, I think of it as like a successor. But we started another effort. So it's still distroless style containers. At our company, it's a new open source project. But in this case, we actually built the full Linux distro ourselves rather than relying on Debian as an upstream. So the distro itself is called Wolfie, WOLFI. And this way we designed the actual distro for distroless containers. So the packages are much finer grained. It's much easier to use the package manager to get exactly what you need. It's more extensible. And the packages themselves are designed for containers. So we don't have any Linux kernel anywhere because you don't need one. That takes away a lot of the work. All we have is those user space programs. And it's a lot simpler syntax for adding new packages and adding new packages to your images too. And so what this means is we build OpenSSL ourselves. We build the Java JVM ourselves. When we add a new programming language, we bootstrap that compiler the very first time. That can be fun in a bunch of cases. So Rust, for example, has a specific build of Rust as the bootstrap build. So when you grab the Rust compiler, you first start with that one. Then you use that Rust compiler to compile the next version of the Rust compiler because that's written in Rust. And then you use that one to recompile itself. So you get an actual trust chain all the way back to even the compilers that you're using. And then you use those trusted compilers to build the rest of the programs. So it's a lot of work building a Linux distro, but this way it's more vertically integrated. It's our version of the JVM. We can patch it, and that helps us minimize attack surface and also harden everything.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Yeah. So I guess when you think of the challenges you see right with the supply chain security, particularly in commercial, let's start with commercial products first.
Yeah.
What are your key challenges and struggles, I guess?
A lot of companies struggle with where to start, to be honest, because it really is overwhelming. They have a giant mix of first party code. In a large enough organization, they even treat, there's this term called intersource that comes up a lot where it's code reuse from different parts of the same company. And this can be especially challenging when you're a large multinational company with folks in different countries and a shifting geopolitical landscape like we're seeing this year. Um, there's also vendor software. A lot of the, there's a stat, but a lot of the banks out there actually employ more engineers than the tech companies. But at the same time, they're procuring 10 times as much software as they're writing internally. So it's a first party problem, it's a second party inside of your company problem, and it's a third party problem too. And you need to get a handle on all of it. So I think folks are looking for a place to start. They're looking for a way to show impact immediately. And then they're looking for a long term roadmap of how to actually get to a secure state without getting in developers' way, without slowing them down.
Yeah, and that's the struggle, right? The balance between security and velocity, right? And it's always a trade-off. How do you see companies reacting, right, to all of this? Do you see pushbacks? I know when the government is starting to ask, okay, you need to provide, SBOMs. A lot of companies were like, well, I can give it to you, but it can't be public. We wanna hide those.
Yeah.
They don't like the transparency. They claim, oh, it's going to put them at risk, but I don't know which one is putting them more at risk. Putting the hand in the sand or just sharing publicly that kind of stuff, which is not like anyone can run a scan on their products
Yeah.
anyway. So what's your thought there?
Yeah, we see a lot of that. The SBOM space has heated up a lot with regulations and recommendations from NIST and other government agencies. I think SBOMs have a very important use case and role in the supply chain. It's going to change the way software procurement works a lot, though, and it's going to be a little while for folks to get ready. But especially the way the government tends to procure software, where they buy it box software, they install it, and they run it on prem for very good security reasons. But that makes it really hard for vendors to handle the security remediation lifecycle for you. They might not even know you're still running certain versions of software. They might not be able to contact you to let you know that there's an issue with it in those kind of air gap setups. It's completely different from SaaS. And so in that world, it really does make sense to hand the consumer a software bill of materials, which contains everything inside of that. So the consumer can be proactive with that information. They can reach out, they can get their own patches, they can figure out when there's a vulnerability that they have to take action against. At the same time, that transparency is scary for a lot of companies that aren't used to providing that deep of an insight into the software that they're shipping. Some of it is, out of fear of embarrassment, and I think that's actually going to provide a good signal back to the procurement process. If somebody's scared to show an SBOM because the software is written in a 25-year-old memory unsafe, deprecated build of COBOL that's not getting patches anymore, then yeah, they probably should be embarrassed to show you that. But that's still a good reason to demand to see it. So you might consider an alternative in that case. My main worry, at least in the short term, is that the false positive noise is only going to get worse. Today, like you said, people can still point scanners at stuff and get a good guess of what's inside of that. With SBOMs now, you're giving people 1,000 different things to point those scanners at. So we're going to see that false positive and vulnerability noise issue go up by a factor of 1,000 in the next couple of years until we get better tools to manage the false positives and show more fine-grained, more actionable vulnerability data.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. So I guess when you think of the differences between COTS and open source, is the open source world much worse because of lack of funding? Is it who has the biggest challenges, I guess?
Oh man, that comes up a lot. Funding in open source is a real challenge. There's tons of funding out there. It's not evenly distributed. It's not always put to the right places where there's single maintainers holding up projects that power a large portion of the internet. But from everything I've seen, as a whole, the security of open source code is much, much, much better than the security of proprietary code. It's too late at this point. Open source is here. You're not going to pull back on that. And it's a great starting point. The Linus's law is real. We do see way more transparency. We see way more bug fixes. We see the quality in general is just higher for open source because of the velocity. The problem, though, is the way companies consume it. They consume it the same way as they consume commercial off-the-shelf software, where they're grabbing builds from the internet. They're not doing any vetting process on them, and then they're just keeping them around for years and years and years. That's the big shift that we have to see. Software ages like milk is a phrase I've heard. You can't just expect to grab something off of a package manager, install it on some service, and then never have to touch it again. Vulnerabilities are found every day. Every time you introduce a new package or a new piece of software, you need a process for keeping that up to date, for handling the vulnerability remediation and notifications, and dealing with any security issues as they come. The Log4Shell incident last year, it was a big eye-opening moment for folks. For anyone that's not aware, Log4j is one of the most commonly used logging libraries in Java, which is one of the most commonly used programming languages in the world. This library was pretty much everywhere in the entire Java ecosystem. And about a 10-year-old bug was found that allowed a trivial remote code execution by an attacker in pretty much any program that was running any version of Log4j from the last 10 years. That was a huge eye-opening moment because folks had to scramble over that weekend when the vulnerability was disclosed to figure out exactly where they were running those versions of Log4j and get patches out. The open source community handled that great, right? There was a bug in the code. They fixed it within a couple days. They handled the disclosure process correctly, and they got it patched and updated. But we're still seeing organizations, including a federal organization just a couple months ago, get compromised because they still haven't updated that version of Log4j. That's not an open source problem to me. That's a commercial proprietary software lifecycle management problem that companies are facing. I think I saw a stat where over 40% of the companies that had remediated Log4j completely had reintroduced vulnerable versions in the following year because they scrambled, paid close attention that week, but then forgot and let up throughout the rest of the year. So this one is endemic, I guess is the right way to put it. That package was so widely deployed that it's going to be a decade before all vulnerable instances of it are wiped out. So attackers are going to keep that in their toolbox. They're always going to look for that as a pivot when they do gain a foothold. And we're going to be dealing with it for the next 10 years.
Yeah, no, that's so Darren was mentioning, right? Don't you think that our adversaries are taking advantage of the reliance on open source? And there's a whole debate, in the department, people pushing back on open source. We should build everything. But let's face it, the government is so good at building software, so that would be a lot of fun to have the government, reinvent every open source project on the planet just so we can control supply chain, which effectively will only put us 50 years behind, which will make us probably way more insecure than relying on open source bits. But what's your take on kind of that reliance of open source? Every commercial
Yeah,
project is using open source, so
yeah. I'm sure people are taking advantage of it. Like you said, there's no other option. It take 50 years to rewrite all of this. All the stats I've seen, around somewhere between 90 and 98% of the code in a commercial application is open source. It's the tip of the iceberg kind of metaphor. The code you write with all of your business logic is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of all of the code that goes into powering that. So yeah, I'm sure people are taking advantage of it. That's what we're starting to see in the last couple of years. Attackers are shifting to the supply chain, and open source is a big portion of the supply chain. Um,
Right.
there's a lot of theories for why that's only really started happening in the last couple of years. Um, we've known about supply chain attacks since 1984 was the first record I've ever found of one, and that was Ken Thompson's famous paper called "Reflections on Trusting Trust," where he showed that
Mm-hmm.
if you can backdoor a compiler, you can use that backdoor to propagate into all the programs the compiler produces, including other compilers. So you can kind of get these self-propagating, undetectable backdoors just by, hacking around with one compiler. But nobody really cared about it until almost 40 years later. And I think that's really because we've gotten finally decent enough at other forms of security. We have TLS everywhere, so you're not sending your bank password in plain text HTTP headers when you log in at a Starbucks. Zero trust is, yeah, sure, a massive buzzword and a waste of energy and air in a lot of circumstances, but it is providing real, phishing-proof MFA systems that make it that much harder to break in through the front door. So I think that's why we're starting to see adversaries and attackers shift to reliance on the supply chain. It's a whole
Mm-hmm.
different attack model. You can't be as targeted with it, but the impacts can be quite broad, like we've seen with SolarWinds or the attacks on Travis CI or Circle CI or even LastPass. You could look at it as a supply chain attack in the last couple of years. So until we catch up there, they're going to keep attacking this, and at some point they'll move off to something else. That's how the cat and mouse game of security always plays out.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Yeah, that's a good rundown of the risks there. Um, so you have this kind of new concept around Wolfie, the distroless distro to reduce effectively, right? Same as a distroless concept, but to reduce the attack vector. But what's different from the initial distroless? Are you targeting more open source bits, or what's the vision there? I guess.
Yeah, you kind of got at this before. You were asking, what it takes to add a new package, all of that configuration, and that tooling was hard to scale, hard to maintain, hard to add new versions of things because it was reliant on Debian as an upstream distro. The main change now is that we've cut out the middleman. We are the entire distro in that Wolfie project. So every package we build directly from source ourselves. So it's really easy for us to add new packages. We don't have to ask anyone else. This means more programming languages. This means more versions of existing programming languages. A lot of other distros have kind of a one version policy where if you want Node.js from Red Hat, they give you a specific version. If you want
Mm-hmm.
Python from Debian, you get a specific version of Python, and you're stuck on that until they update. We've designed this just for containers, so it makes it much more flexible that way. We can package every single version of Python and let you pick the exact one you want in your container at build time. So a
Right.
lot more flexibility, a lot more package choice, both in terms of versions and breadth, and then even more hardening because we compile it all. So we can set all of those compiler hardening flags to the highest possible levels that someone might not want to do for a general purpose distribution because there could be, say, some performance impact. We can make choices around memory safety. One example there is curl. The curl project, another one of the most widely used libraries in the world, has a backend that lets you use a Rust implementation of HTTP parsing and also TLS instead of a C
Mm-hmm.
version. That's really new, and no other distro opted into shipping that one yet. Most people still use
Right.
the C code. We're able to do that because it's our distro. We can just change those flags and use those hardened versions wherever possible.
And so, how do you? Is it going to be a paid model? How do you make
Mhm.
it accessible? I guess.
Yeah, so Wolfie itself is comprised of open source software. Wolfie is also open source. If you look at the GitHub repo, github.com/wolfie-dev/os, you'll see a ton of YAML files. Each YAML file in there is one package. That's all open source. You can see it. You can see how we do the builds. What we charge for is support for the built images. So it's really kind of like a software factory as a service or image catalog as a service. We have a free tier,
Mm-hmm.
so you can get started with a whole bunch of the images for free. And we also have paid versions, which are typically older versions of the software that we're backporting patches to.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So is that going to help you scale, or what's going to be the struggle with getting this adopted? I guess
Mhm.
at massive scale. I guess.
Um, No struggle yet. It's working. People like it. People
Yeah.
like the CVE free images. A lot of folks don't believe it when you point the scanners at it and they return 0. There are some sometimes, so we fix them quickly so we can show those as examples of the scanners actually working. But just packaging more stuff, really. Where we're moving to now is actually it's very similar to the Iron Bank and a lot of the projects that you worked on at Platform One.
Yeah.
We're building a whole catalog here of not just the programming languages and not just those packages, but a catalog of full off-the-shelf images. So if you're running Helm charts or some of these collections of packages, we're building those too. So you can just grab a hardened Postgres application and drop that right into your cluster, or a hardened Grafana or Prometheus setup for monitoring, or Dex for authentication, or Cert Manager for TLS. So in addition to stuff that you're going to build your application on top of, you can just grab full off-the-shelf apps and get started with them, knowing where they came from. We have the signatures, we have the provenance, we have the SBOMs, and then trusting that the vulnerabilities will be handled for you, also transparently.
Interesting. That makes sense. So anyone can. So where do people go to try it?
The GitHub repo is there, wolfie-dev/os, or the link scrolling here at the bottom has a link to all of the images you can try out. ChainGuard.dev/ChainGuard-images
Yeah.
has the full catalog. And you can file new
And
requests. It takes us just a couple hours to get a new image out. I do some of them myself on the weekends when I have some spare time. I just did Zookeeper and Gnats a few days ago, so more coming.
very nice. How many you got now? You said.
It's about I think it's about 700 packages last I looked, and then on the images side, I'm not sure. Somewhere probably around 50, I would say.
Yeah.
More if you count multiple versions. Like say we have we have 7 different versions of Ruby. I don't know quite how we're counting that, if we're counting that as just one or multiple. But,
Do you do databases too?
yep. Yeah. So we have MariaDB, we have Postgres, we have SQLite, we have Redis, we have Memcached. Working on a lot more.
Yeah, that's very cool.
I think
Very
Cassandra's on our list somewhere next.
Ha. Good. So, when you see what's happening, in fact, the person before mentioned kind of nation states, right, using and I'm going to put the link here on the screen. Here we go. Nation states using open tools and kind of getting inside of projects or getting into build servers, right? So where do you see nation state actors moving towards to?
Yeah. That other question was a good prompt here. If you have the level of investment and patience and time of a nation state, um, this is definitely terrifying. Um, Even lower funded APTs are finding footholds in supply chains, software supply chains, and open source projects all over. You mentioned those kind of email takeover attacks at the start. That was one a researcher pointed out, but it could have been abused by nation states or attackers for years. The basic model is you go to PyPy, find all of the maintainers of all of the packages, which is all public information. They have email addresses there. And then check to see which of the domains in those email addresses have expired. A lot of people run personal domains for their email and then forget to renew it. You take that list now. I think it was hundreds at the time this happened, and then you just go buy those domains for $7. Create the email address, and then do an account reset. Nobody can tell that you're not the actual owner because you do own the domain name. And now you have permissions to push to those packages, and some of those packages are getting downloaded thousands of times a day or more than that. And now you've just gotten arbitrary code execution inside of any organization that's downloading any of those packages from an abandoned maintainer. The creativity and opportunities are endlessly terrifying here. So we're definitely going to see continued focus on this. The other big problem with supply chain attacks in the context of nation states is that the consequences of getting caught are basically zero. A lot of what we're seeing are people throwing up burner fake GitHub accounts and sending PRs and hoping something gets merged. It's not the same as getting caught breaking into a system. If it gets caught, whoops, that account gets banned, gets taken down, and all you wasted was a couple hours writing that script. It's hard to actually trace these back to real people and hold anyone responsible.
And so when you think of the broader scope of all these projects, right? There's also fake projects with names that look similar, right?
Yeah.
And
Typo squatting.
people
Yeah.
use the wrong, right, the wrong package. So when you think of picking an open source part, let's say you have you have to build a feature, and you need to pick an open source dependency to help you accelerate that feature, so you don't have to rebuild it from scratch, right? What do you pay attention to when you look at GitHub
Yeah.
repos?
The easiest signal and the highest success one, and it's not perfect, is just how long the project has been around and how many maintainers it has. People do those typo squatting attacks constantly, and the only thing they can't really fake is time. You can't go back and pretend the repo was created 5 or 6 years ago and has been in use since. But you can create tons of them. You can even fake Git history to make stuff look like it's been around. We've seen that a lot. But yeah, the best is to trust the same people that have been doing it for a while. The only thing we can really rely on at the end of the day is trust and reputation. So if there's a project maintained by someone that's put their name out there and they've been working on it for years, that's going to be more trustworthy than something that just popped up from an anonymous account that you have no idea the track record of. It's not perfect, but it's really kind of the only useful signal out there today.
Yeah, but how do you, for us in DoD, how do you
Yeah.
prevent, projects that are managed by Chinese, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. It comes up a lot. And the weird counterpoint is, I guess, one, you can't do it because the internet's anonymous. And
Right.
I've seen a lot of pushback on projects that have primarily Chinese or Russian or maintainers from a certain country. Um, the weird part though is you never see pushback on projects that have anonymous maintainers, and you have no idea where those people are. You just can't really make decisions based on that today, unless you completely change the way open source development works. Too much of it relies on anonymity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's also pretty easy to create a fake persona, right?
Exactly.
So
Yeah. So if we start seeing policy based decisions around where the maintainers are from, it's going to be impossible unless you start requiring that for the actual names and contact info for all maintainers, which you just can't do today.
yeah, and so let's say you see project that
Yeah.
has Chinese,
Mhm.
like let's talk about what is it, notary, right? Notary
Mhm.
had the
Mhm.
a recent issue. Maybe give a little bit of context for what happened with notary this month.
Yeah, it's not specific to that one project. There have been a lot of cases lately, especially for folks working in regulated industries in the U.S., where you have to worry about the trade sanctions and the entity lists around which companies you're allowed to do business with. Open source projects are set up and done in the open, and the contributors can come from anywhere. Like we said, they can even be anonymous. Somebody has to be reviewing that code at the end of the day, but contributions can come from you know GitHub accounts that were created several minutes ago. So I think this is a case of foreign policy conflicting with open source standards and governance and politics and foundation management. Um, and then when you talk about the federal sector, like you work in, and like a lot of folks do, you might have even stricter rules around that. And so it's just possible that certain projects are not going to be able to be used in certain sectors because of where those contributors live. At the end of the day, though, it is all based on self-reported data for where people are. So it's really hard to make decisions based on any of this today. You know, the threat model that really worries me, and I think you have a question next, and it really ties into it. So I'm trying not to answer the next question, but I guess we're getting to it anyway.
Yeah, but
Um,
take it,
yeah, the next one is what keeps me up at night. I think, and it's really related
right?
to this nation state threat. I think the what keeps me up at night is kind of that long game, that long con attack where anybody could do this today. And I think you'd be crazy not to be as a nation state. Just have 3 or 4 people start writing useful open source projects. Get those open source projects adopted. Don't even do anything malicious for a while. You can do that for as long as you want. 3 engineers in a year could build a ton of useful projects. And then at the end of the day, you now have control of the supply chain of anyone dependent on that project. And yeah, it takes time to build up trust, but you can do that with time and patience. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot of those where projects have been around for a long time before something bad happens to them. And I don't know of any way to prevent against that in the long run.
But in a sense, wouldn't also the time is great, right?
Yeah,
But you could also argue that you get a lot of technical debt, a lot of issues, right? A lot of old accounts, like you said, that could expire, domain could expire.
yeah.
So is that just enough to really, I guess you can also look at the velocity of commits and
Mhm.
are they cleaning accounts, but can you really understand that? You see a lot of contributors that have completely stopped, right?
Yeah.
Helping a project, yet they still have access to it. Why isn't there a better
Oh yeah.
basic access control management, right?
Yeah, yeah. That kind of ties into it's really hard to tell if a project is abandoned or not. Stable projects that have been around forever are some of the most trusted ones, but they don't see a lot of work happening on them. The curl project still has a lot of activity, but you probably don't know which version you're running because most of the core feature set is stable. If you compare that to
Right,
something like Bash, is work still happening there? It's not going to resemble the same type of project as say Kubernetes, where there's thousands of PRs opened each month and a huge community adding features constantly. In
right.
some ways, a project that isn't moving fast is more trustworthy. Right? There's fewer commits for you to have to review, but
Right.
putting one of those next to a project where the maintainer has disappeared and is abandoned, you're not going to be able to tell the difference from the outside.
Yeah.
I think there's a bunch of security protocols. That rely on the dead man's switch or something like that.
Hmm.
The update framework or tough is one of those where without getting highly specific, uh, software has to report that there is no update available. You can't just assume that you'll know when one is available. Every day you have to publish something saying, "Hey, no updates today." And that results in a much more secure system. I think we need
Hmm.
something like that for projects. Like, hey, yeah, you can publish a little update once a week saying, "Hey, this project is still maintained, even if there are no commits to it." But that's a
Right.
lot of work, and people don't do that today. But no, those ambient permissions are huge too. A lot of maintainers just drift away from a project for a couple months, a year, something like that. And I rarely see projects force those people out to minimize the permissions that they have laying around. There's a
And they should
lot.
at least reduce the permissions, right?
Sorry, what was that?
They should at least reduce the permissions.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think most projects should be set up in order where no one has permissions to push directly to the repository, and GitHub is adding a lot of support for that now, being able to force reviews. GitHub is actually, I think, today rolling out mandatory multi-factor authentication for all GitHub accounts. Um, it's somewhat terrifying to think that they didn't have that before today. Like only today can you actually even check to see, like, trust that the maintainers have multi-factor authentication turned on. So even if you trust those maintainers and they are great people, um, all it takes is them losing a laptop inside of a coffee shop, and now somebody has write permissions to all the repositories that person had, or
Yeah.
password theft. Um,
Yeah, I mean, and you've seen people trying to manage to still get access despite MFA with the MFA spamming and people click yes like idiots,
yes,
so you've seen that too, right? So
yeah, it's not perfect, but it's better than yeah, a reused
yeah, you need
password
it for
in
sure.
LastPass or something. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's scary out there. There was a tweet a long time ago. I can't remember who it was from, but the phrasing really resonated with me. So, your threat model now includes the password on the laptop of every single contributor to any open source project you rely on.
Hmm.
Yeah, you can harden all of your equipment, but it's only as secure as the least secure contributor's computer.
So you're giving a lot of ammunition for people that want duty to stop using open source bits there.
They could
What's
try,
your
yeah.
balance? What do you tell people? What would be the outcome, right? If
Yeah.
tomorrow DoD bans open source use?
Yeah, you can't do it. I mean, it's impossible. So that's why, yeah, people are going to criticize this and say, and saying open source is insecure. It's too critical. There's no possible way you could build a system without it. So instead, shift the conversation to how do we do that securely? You're not going to rewrite everything from scratch, and if you do, it's going to be worse and be full of way more embarrassing logic bugs than the stuff that you are using today. So it's a trade off. And I think we can do it securely, and I think we can make it much easier for everyone to use the same open source, which has a lot of benefits. But it's going to take time and care. And I think the big one is you have to pay attention to what you're using. That's the biggest one. And the
Yeah.
second big piece of advice we give, which is this one's probably way more out there for DoD and federal use cases, you have to update your software frequently. You can't stay on old versions and use that as a security mechanism. You have to constantly update, and staying closer to the latest version is going to put you in a way better position than staying way far behind. and I think that's
Right.
going to be the biggest shift for the DoD.
Do you think
Because you
DoD should be tracking the large open source project they use and maybe even fund some pen testing and of these projects?
Yeah, absolutely. Staying up to date, funding pen tests help, audits help. What we've started doing, and we've done this for free for a bunch of open source projects, but our company runs free audits of the supply chain. So yeah, you can
Mm,
have pen tests, you can fuzz the application code, but if the binary is shipped from a Jenkins machine under someone's desk, it doesn't matter how secure the code was. And I think,
right.
especially based on how the DoD consumes open source, I know they're not building it all from source themselves, and I know there are a lot of hardening efforts, but at the end of the day, you're still grabbing container images from somewhere. You're still grabbing packages from somewhere. I think those types of audits and funding are even more impactful today than the application bug level ones.
Yeah, no doubt. So, you know, what's next? When you look at the supply chain market, both on the risk threat side and
hmm
the solution side, what's the next big thing, I guess?
Yeah, I'm the market, I guess, is kind of waiting. A lot of this is being regulatory driven,
Mm-hmm.
and at least in my experience, a lot of the cybersecurity regulations are playing catch up to what best practices already were in the industry. But I think in these last couple of years, particularly related to supply chain, the regulations are actually starting to push the envelope beyond what companies were doing. So instead of just codifying it and giving people paperwork to explain how what they're doing already maps to a threat matrix or cybersecurity framework, folks are going to have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of work to do to keep up with these. In particular, the Secure Software Development Framework from NIST, the SSDF. If you haven't read that, it's like, I mean, I hope no one's actually read the whole thing. It's like 800 pages or something massive, and it ranges from typical best practices like use MFA to really really out there things that I don't think a significant percentage of the industry is doing, but are necessary, like stuff like the hermetic builds, secure build environments, multi-factor review on everything, code review on everything, including open source. So it's
Mm-hmm.
going to be the next big thing is going to be seeing how the industry reacts to these.
Right. Right. And what do you see so far in terms of feedback you're getting
Mhm,
with your, OpenSSF engagement and stuff?
mhm. Um, the level of interest is amazing. The amount of folks actually paying attention to this now, I think that's step one in making a big change, is getting people interested, paying attention, and ready to move. And the attackers help there, I guess. Seeing an attack in the news every week on an open source project makes it hard to forget about this and move on and run out of an attention span. Um, the next thing is just going to be folks putting it into production. The economy, the layoffs, shifting priorities over the last 6 months, I think have slowed things down a bit. But at the end of the day, you can't cut your cybersecurity budget and expect to keep running a successful company. So
Right.
it's going to have to get solved eventually.
What do you see now with the economy and
Mhm.
SBV and all the stuff that's happening? I know you guys were
Yeah.
using the bank, so that must have been maybe you can share a little bit of that journey with the audience here.
Yeah. Yeah.
What will
So
you do differently now? What have you learned also as an
oh man.
entrepreneur?
Yeah. So for anyone who's not aware, Silicon Valley Bank or SVB um, was taken into receivership by the FDIC and the government on Friday because of a mass exodus in accounts. It was basically a run on the bank happened in one day. Ourselves and a lot of the rest of the industry, especially the startup industry, used SVB as their primary bank. And so, it was my first time going through the collapse of a bank, especially one we were using. I know, they happen somewhat regularly every couple of years. 2008 was the last huge one, huge wave of these.
Yeah, that's not
It's
really a couple of years, but yeah,
Yeah, I
50.
mean,
Yeah,
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 companies have been around, people have been around, people remember it, I guess.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so
It's not every
yeah,
day though.
it's not every day. And yeah, just causing a huge amount of uncertainty in the industry, I'd say. Um, Thankfully, this one is mostly resolved. I think
Have you gotten your money back or what's going on?
we have access to our account again. Yes, it was. I think everyone was trying to log in at the same time yesterday, so it turned into a load test on the bank website. But yeah, everything's been restored now at this point. And yeah, I think we're learning about the supply
Are you
chain
supposed to
of
move it or
banks
are you
too.
supposed to keep it there?
Um, It depends. I mean, yeah, it's I'm not a financial advisor, asterisk,
Right.
asterisk. But yeah, it depends. I
But
mean,
are they telling you to leave it, or are they telling you you can do whatever you want with it?
the bank is open again, so like things are
Right.
working. You can access it. Money can go in. Money can come out. It's been guaranteed all of the deposits. So yeah, I think it's causing everyone to reevaluate, get multiple vendors set up, which probably should have been in place in the first place. And then we're learning
Yeah.
about the supply chain of it too. A lot of payroll processors use that bank, and so even if you weren't using them, payroll could have been affected because they were somewhere in the supply chain of how your
Right.
money got to your employees.
Right. Yeah. They have to get the money
Yeah,
at some point. It's not magical.
yeah.
Uh, and so when you for you, what have you learned? I guess are you gonna, if you raise a pretty big round of funding, obviously, you can't just split it into 250 grand account. That's not doable. So you
Yeah,
go, what are you
I
gonna
just
do? You
saw a
go to the
headline.
big guys?
There's an NBA player who apparently did that with his money. He has 50 different bank accounts sitting at $250,000 in each one because he really wanted to stay under the limit. But no, it's hard. There's no risk-free way to sit on a large amount of money like that. And logistically, for companies around our size, when you're running payroll a couple times a month, just that payroll amount gets you above the FDIC limit. So it really is a challenge.
You have how many people you got now?
We're right around 60 people.
Yeah, and it's not inexpensive people.
Yeah, we have
Pretty, yeah,
some great engineering team.
yeah. So it's obviously gets to quite a bit of money every payroll. So you
Yes.
need to have an account with that, at least that plus. So that makes life pretty. I don't know how
Yeah.
I don't know. There's no magical answer, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's some services out there that pool accounts and help you kind of automate that, so you spread it across multiple accounts automatically. But there's always a limit at the end of the day.
yeah, Patrick was asking if they're gonna let you close the account if you want to close it, or if you were to
Um, I'm
decide to
not sure.
move it.
I'm sure you can
Yeah.
close it if you want to. It's the bank is reopened today. Everything is acting as normal. So
Did you have to use the bank because of the VCs told you to use it, or what was the story behind
we didn't have
using
to.
it? I guess.
It was recommended
Yeah,
to us. A lot of other companies use them. Yeah, we could have used any bank, but
that's by the recommendation now.
yeah,
I
yeah. I mean,
guess.
they had great customer service. They still do. So I think that's why a lot of folks use them, especially for startups that don't, have only been around a couple days. Getting a bank account open is hard.
Right. So you feel like I always wonder why the VCs pushed it so
Mhm.
much. There has to be something, right? It can't
Yeah,
just be like, oh, they have good customer service. You should use the bank. I mean, there has to be something there, right?
yeah. I'm not sure. They I mean, yeah, working with startups is interesting, knowing how they operate,
Right.
going from not existing to getting a bank account number in 2 days, and then having a large amount of money wired directly
Right.
into it. Probably isn't the typical profile that other banks are used to dealing with.
That's true. That's
So
true.
yeah, it's definitely a little bit of a different model, and so someone
So
that
it's a
understands
different,
that
yeah,
helps.
different kind of way of thinking. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And you guys have your last round of funding was when?
Um, just under a year ago, so I think like it closed April or May of last year.
May of last year. And
Yeah.
how much runway do you usually keep in the company for cash flow?
That varies a lot. The in the 2020, 2021 kind of time frame when interest rates were
Right.
really low,
Right.
a lot of folks were getting kind of greedy and raising small rounds with little
Yeah.
runway. The market shifted dramatically last year as
Yeah.
interest rates climbed. We're positioned for years,
Yeah.
many years, so we're very lucky that way.
So you think what's the healthy number that you would recommend startups to have
Oh
in the
man,
bank?
as much as
Is it
possible right
18
now.
months?
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's kind of the general rule of thumb. It was kind of shifting down below that when interest rates
Yeah.
were low, and now it's climbing beyond that. It's really based on you and the company size, what milestones you want to hit. There's no single answer. It's really you need to
Right.
have enough to get to whatever that next thing is. Maybe it's profitability, so maybe you have infinite runway. Maybe it's getting a product out the door. Maybe it's some other milestone. You need to have enough to meet that comfortably. It's also
Right.
challenging the whole the easiest time to raise money is when you don't need it. If you get
Right.
desperate, it makes it much harder to raise money. And so
Yes.
yeah, it's like all things in
Yeah.
life, it's a double edged sword.
Yeah. And how do you feel about, when you started, I guess, when did the company start again, you said?
October 2021, so about a year
So
and a
it's
half
not
ago.
even been, so it's been, yeah, almost a year and a half.
Yeah.
And when you started, did you raise money immediately, I guess? How did you start?
Yeah, a couple weeks after we started the company. That was a great time to be
That's
raising
pretty
money.
immediate. Pretty immediate. So
Yeah.
you had nothing. I mean, you had you and the founders
Yep.
and it was a napkin kind of deal, I guess.
Basically, yeah. And yeah, open source projects. There's a huge ecosystem of investors that specialize in kind of developer focused tools, security tools, open
Mm,
source projects. There's a pretty good framework for it's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's a now like GitLab, Mongo, a lot of these other companies have
right.
proven you can build successful public companies on open source. It's a lot easier to explain that.
It's called the COTS now, the commercial open
Yes,
source
yeah,
software, right? Yeah.
yeah.
With
I think years
JJ
ago
pushing it.
everyone kind of doubted it, but there's huge public companies now that have made massive businesses on it, so it's a lot
Yeah,
easier.
JJ has been doing a good job promoting it.
Yeah,
Although I just call it COTS because if you
yeah,
have locked-in features, on top of open source, I'm not sure what makes you so different from commercial software at the end of the
yeah.
day.
I look at it like Slack. Like Slack has a free trial. Anybody can go get started with it, play around with it, and get the
Right,
tool going, and then you convert later. I look at it a lot of those business models. Open source is like a free trial for developers.
right.
It lets them play with it, lets them
The
use it, lets
difference
them
is
customize
some
it.
of these companies are putting all these key, features for enterprise, like, all back and like,
Yep. Mhm.
basic things like that in the paid version. So it's like, I don't know if you really have a choice. It's not really a
Yeah.
trial. It's not really, it's just like you need to have it. You can't.
Yeah. You need it.
I mean, particularly if you're security focused, I mean, it's like, yeah, I'm not going to do all back on my stuff. I'm just going
Yeah.
to wing it.
Yeah.
That's not going to work. Right. So,
Depending on how the regulations pan out, vendors are supposed to start collecting attestations from their vendors around the NIST Secure Software Development Framework. And open
yeah.
source is not excluded. I could see a lot of open source businesses getting formed just around that. Sure, the code's free, you get it from PyPI, but if you want me to sign an attestation saying it's secure, you have to pay for that piece
Right.
of
You,
paper.
you pay for the support and you pay for the
Yeah.
compliance.
Yes.
But that's a better model than, you know, making sure that the key basic
Yeah.
features are paid. I just hate it. Then don't call yourself open source because really you're not. You can't use it, right? Not
Yeah.
in a meaningful way. So it just that
Right.
just makes me mad. I
Yeah.
just
If
like I don't
if
mind buying costs, right? Just call it a cost. Don't play games.
Yeah, there's a website that collects that, like all the products that charge a ton more money for SSO or
Yeah, just
some of
basic
those
things,
enterprise
right?
features. Yeah.
It's just like all back just makes me mad because it's
Yeah.
really like you're pushing people to have the wrong security behavior.
Yes.
It's a very toxic mindset. You know, you don't want to
Yeah.
push the
It's
wrong
what people
behavior.
need to pay for. Yeah.
And I loved your idea of like, hey, but for compliance, signing,
Yeah.
um, FIPS, even FIPS, I kind of push back a little bit on FIPS, but I at least I understand. Hey, you have to swap the FIPS bits to FIPS compliance stuff. Although you could just do that from the get go. But
Yeah.
that's just
Yeah,
interesting.
we're working on getting FIPS versions of all of the crypto in Wolfie. So that, yeah, those are the features I love to charge for.
Yeah. What made you engage with the government
In which regard?
in terms of like being interested to
Oh,
to help the federal agencies, I guess.
yeah. I mean, the national security aspect is huge. Like you pointed out, it's one of the trickiest intersections of geopolitics, security, and open source. So there's just a huge pull from that sector for all the work we're doing.
Did
Um,
you see any pushback from some of, I mean, I know there's a lot of, people living in what I call the kumbaya bubble in Silicon Valley and stuff where they're just anti-government or anti-military or whatnot. So did you have a pushback from the employees to say, hey, we're gonna do government stuff?
I mean, the pushback is really just that procurement is so slow at the government that
Right, right.
it's around the amount of
But not
time
like
sink that it
on the
takes.
on the
Yeah,
principle of it. Like
yeah.
Google. I mean, there was a bunch of Googlers that signed,
Mhm,
the memo to stop
mhm,
working with Product Maven and stuff, right?
mhm.
So,
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging, right? Everyone has different opinions. I
yeah,
think in the security space, I don't think it helps anyone to make
right.
to not help people get secure.
Yeah.
Everyone
Particularly your
deserves.
nation.
Yeah, everyone deserves to have basic cybersecurity. So yeah,
If your nation gets hacked, I'm pretty sure everything falls apart. I don't
yeah,
know how you could. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure people will be pretty short-sighted at that point.
Yeah.
Even if you don't like it, it's just common sense. And how do you feel it's been going, kind of that government engagement stuff? Do you find it to be, obviously it's a good edge against the economy
Yeah.
problems because the government always has money,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
They're a
and
great customer once you get through and
so
navigate
where are
through
you
these.
on that? Where are you in that government adoption?
Yeah, we haven't focused too much on direct federal sales yet,
Hmm.
just because it's slow and we're still so young.
Yeah,
What we're seeing a lot of is like federal adjacent stuff, where people
right.
working through FedRAMP trying to sell to the government need a lot of our products, or
Yeah.
other folks selling to those agencies. So
You don't
that's
have a federal team, right?
correct.
Yet.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
That could,
it's on the
I mean,
roadmap.
I guess you're getting at the point where it's, I would accelerate that roadmap.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
I think you're right there. If I
Yeah.
had a recommendation for you, I think it's time.
Yeah.
Both because of the momentum in the government and the mandate, but also the economy. I think it's a good edge, and I think
Hmm.
it's not as painful as I mean, I'm going through it with Sage and getting a Saber phase 1, phase 2. Getting a good reseller like Carasoft or whatnot. They do a very good job, right? So,
Yeah.
it might be one FTE, right?
Hmm.
A federal sales guy, and that's it. So it's a
Yeah.
pretty small investment compared to the big scheme of things. But I think for you, it's just like you have to do it, right? I
Yeah.
think it's just
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
it,
especially once we get the FIPS stuff, the FIPS certification and
right.
all of that.
You
I
can
don't
have the
think there'll be
FIPS
too many
and
other blockers. So
yeah, and your engagement, with the foundation.
mhm.
Obviously, there's all these discussion with the White House and the SBOM stuff, and having that turnkey solution, right?
Mhm.
It's just so obvious, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and we've had some decent success in Iron Bank too. We got some Wolfie images put through to there to start showing that as an option for folks. So
you have Python
yeah,
yet? Because I need Python and I need Node.js.
do you need it to be in the Iron Bank?
Yeah, I
Okay.
do.
We don't have those in the Iron Bank. We can send a PR though. I think we need
That'd be
somebody to
great.
ask for it. I think that's the new process. So yeah,
Well,
well,
you just say I asked for it. That's usually
perfect.
good enough.
Perfect.
Yeah. So,
Yeah,
um,
send us the versions. We'll get them in there for you.
yeah, I mean, I use the latest. I think
Perfect.
Node.js 18 and Python 3.9. I think the 3.9 was the one that
Yep.
it's not the latest, I guess. I don't know why. I
No, we
try,
have.
but people freak out. You can't do the latest on that stuff anymore.
Oh man,
So,
yeah, yeah. We even have the pre-release stuff. We have 3.7, 3.8, 3.9, 10, 11, and 12 is the pre-release. So we've got any Python
yeah,
you want.
yeah, that's awesome. So let's talk a little bit about AI. Of course, I'm
Yeah,
biased,
of
with
course.
that stage, but I obviously I think it's a massive disruption. Sage
Yeah,
wrote 90% of my UI, my backend, 100% of my SQL, my terms and conditions, my logo. The
yeah,
YAML, right? The Docker files,
yeah.
right? And honestly, I mean, I asked it to do an Nginx ingress controller proxy to do CAC authentication, mutual TLS X509 certificate, and it did it, right? And I'm like,
Nice.
holy cow,
Yeah.
that's starting to push the knowledge of, like, really understanding how Nginx configs and the Nginx controller ingress,
Hmm.
which is not just Nginx, so a little bit more recent stuff, so. Well, how do you see that kind of technology disrupt? Are you guys using? Are you developers starting to use
Hmm.
this stuff to help?
Hmm.
Like Copilot and all that GPT powered stuff.
Yeah, I've used it a bunch since it came out. I use it for, yeah, kind of I didn't write my terms and conditions with it, but
Yeah,
yeah, I've used it for
I did.
drafting blog posts, that kind of stuff, and you still go and you fill in the content yourself later and edit it. But yeah, I've used it a ton.
What
Um,
about coding?
yeah, I don't get to code too much anymore myself, but I played with
Oh
it.
yeah,
I One of the challenges I ran into is they kind of cut off access to knowledge in ChatGPT sometime in 2021, and so a lot of the
yeah,
later technologies it just doesn't know about those
but not
yet.
on Sage.
Yeah,
We have
perfect.
the latest stuff.
Yeah,
So,
I'll try that and see if Sage knows how to set up Sigstore and Wolfie.
well,
Yeah,
that's the beauty with Sage. Also, we can train, right, and ingest. We should do that.
yeah,
Ingest all the
mhm,
Sigstore documentation. We have the live button, which pulls, from live sources, but then we can also ingest, and then the beauty is when you ingest, it goes to any model. So it's not just
Perfect.
GPT, it's DaVinci, it's Cohere,
Hmm.
the Google Bard coming. In fact, OpenAI just announced GPT-4 today,
Oh,
although
fun.
it's
I
10x
missed that.
10x more expensive.
Oof.
So it's pretty, it's almost, if you use the full capability, it's almost 10 cents per query, which is
Wow.
you're starting to be a little bit more. It used to be maybe 0.003. So that's a pretty big difference. It's
Wow.
almost like 50x for some use cases. So, but it's able to do crazy stuff. Like you can actually give a picture, and you say, you send a picture of ingredients of food, and it's gonna tell you what you can make with those ingredients from the
Wow.
picture of the ingredients.
Wow.
So it's recognizing the ingredients, which is pretty cool. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure you can do way more than that. It's kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
So they can take images as inputs as well.
Hmm.
So it's interesting. But did you see, like, for me, developer wise, I think easily one developer can turn into five with this,
Hmm.
just by Copilot, auto completing stuff. And, for me, I mean, I had it do, I told it, write a lost password feature for my
Wow.
users. And create a JSON web token that has a 30 minutes expiration date, and use a SendGrid API to email
Wow.
the token to the user. And it knew the SendGrid API, and I
Yeah.
honestly had to change little things, like security stuff. They don't do enough escaping and stuff, so you have to
Sure.
do it. That's why prompt matter, right? You can say securely, if you add words, so it's
Yeah.
going to pay attention to stuff, right? So honestly, the developer job is going to turn into a prompt engineering job based on who is able to write better English, So,
Yeah. Yeah. It's
but
interesting.
it wrote the whole thing, and you can convert like Go to Python and no,
Yeah.
yeah, this code in OJS and in Python, boom, wrote the stuff for me, compiles, works from the get go. So I'm pretty impressed. At the very least, it's gonna either accelerate or you're not gonna hire as many people
Yeah.
that you would otherwise need. Have you had people in the development team start using this stuff too, or maybe
I'm
they're
not.
doing it you don't know?
I'm sure people are. Yeah. Like
Yeah,
with Copilot and IDE integrations. I'm sure people are
yeah.
playing around with it. Yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, there's a lot of. I don't want to keep being doom and gloomy, but there's a lot of security questions to figure out too
Oh
in
yeah.
AI around data provenance and what it's trained on, and
Oh
I've
yeah.
seen a lot
Bias.
of recent prompt injection attacks where somebody could, with your example, somebody could, potentially sneak in a whole bunch of really insecure examples around JWT
Yep.
authentication or something like that in the training data. And then everyone
Yep.
that asks for it to spit out some security code now has a backdoor in all of that code or something like that.
Right. Right.
So at the end of the day, I think, a person still has to
I
be
mean, it's trust but
responsible
verify
for,
for sure. You can't just
yeah,
like
yeah,
copy and paste and forget. Right.
yeah. So you still need a
But
person to be
if it
responsible at
saves
the
you
end.
90% of the typing, it's
Yes.
pretty good.
Yes. Yeah. And you're still there reviewing the code and being the one responsible for it.
It's almost like
So
a
it's kind of
pair
like the open
programming
source
thing.
model too. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
And then, yeah. So I'm sure people are using it.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have a couple of questions before we let you go. We already
Perfect.
took a few.
Is that supposed to be
But
me? My hair's a little different.
no, that's me. That's me.
Oh, perfect.
It doesn't look like me though. It's supposed to be based on my face, but I don't know if that did a good job. All right. So I guess you
Oh,
explained
cool.
it, but
Yeah.
maybe you didn't understand very well, right?
Yeah.
The difference between Let's
Sure.
Encrypt and Sigstore. Obviously Let's Encrypt lets you
Mhm.
create TLS certificates and stuff, but Sigstore is not just about that, right? So
Yeah,
so
yeah. The main difference is the type of certificate. Like Let's Encrypt lets you create TLS certificates for web authentication, which means they're governed by this group called the Browser Forum. The browsers kind of get together and decide what certificate authorities have to do to have their certificates issued and trusted, and they're all specialized for that. Sigstore is basically a copy paste of the architecture, except instead of TLS certificates, we issue code signing certificates. There's no browser form for code signing certificates, so a lot of the checks and balances and guarantees are a little bit shifted. The other main difference is around the way verification works. With TLS certificates, it's somewhat simple. They have to be valid when you're on the website. You can rotate them in the next web connection. You can get a new certificate, and that's fine. But with code signing, you generally want to sign code today, and then verify it later. So the verification and expiration and revocation model is a lot different. If a certificate expires, you don't want all running software to break generally. You want to be able to handle revocation a little bit differently. So some technical differences around that, just because the verification process is a little different, but otherwise it's close to the Let's Encrypt architecture as we could.
And so I guess
Mhm.
you're really streamlining the whole process. It's not a full website, right? So
Right.
it's not to get a website TLS certificate.
Yeah.
Um, it's the lifespan of your bits, I guess, right?
Yeah. You can
So
sign a Git commit, you can sign a container, you can sign a Python package, that kind of stuff.
right. So and could you use it to sign binaries like
Mhm.
non like MSIs, or is it just
Yeah, you can sign anything with it. Windows does have, very specific requirements for driver signing.
yeah,
So
right?
technically, yeah, but like Windows doesn't trust the
Yeah,
certificate
they
authorities from
wouldn't accept
Sigstore,
it,
so it wouldn't run, right?
right? They wouldn't
Um,
recognize it.
but yeah, it's really useful for the kind of container cloud native ecosystem, especially in
Right.
DoD air gap scenarios where we can sign stuff as it's produced. You could, throw it onto a USB drive, however you want to get it inside of an air gap environment, and then still verify it back outside.
So there was a question on Twitter. For people that are releasing non-open source bits,
Hmm.
right? In languages like Python or
Hmm.
non-compiled stuff,
Hmm.
they have a tough time, like with Iron Bank, for example, because they have to, Iron Bank, the container can be downloaded, so you don't want to put the Python bit, the Python code, and then anyone can see the Python,
Right.
right? By downloading the container. So what we did is we encrypt the
Sure.
Python files, and then you need a key
Yep.
to decrypt it at runtime. Is there a cleaner way? Could we think of using Sigstore as a
Hmm.
cleaner way to automate that kind of decryption process? So it's not signing, it's
Hmm. Yeah.
crypto,
Yeah.
but it's kind of the same outcome. I mean, it's the same,
Hmm.
it's obfuscation of code or whatnot. But
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you start going down this road long enough, it starts to look like NFTs. And I don't mean that in a bad way or to gloss over it, but like, yeah, it's like
yeah,
kind of public-private key cryptography where you want to really what you're trying to build there is a licensing system. So whoever owns the license can
right,
decrypt the software and no one else can.
right.
And the Sigstore architecture is transparency logs. NFTs have a blockchain. They do look pretty similar at the end of the day. But yeah, I
Hmm.
think a lot of these entitlement systems and those crypto designs, yeah, do start to look somewhat like a blockchain.
But there's no open source solution for license management.
Right.
So is there an opportunity to because
Probably.
that's a pretty, I mean, not everything can be open source, and that's just
Yeah.
a fact,
Yeah.
and how do we do it for these languages where you can obfuscate code and just try to still
Yeah.
ship the bits?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It looks like that model of yeah, we encrypt the code against somebody's public key, and then
right.
they need that private key to be able to decrypt and run it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
Fun.
Yeah. So let me see. I think we have. Uh, Here we go. Last question for you before we do the
Sure.
parting words. Do you think vulnerability scanning approaches are too focused on known threats, so signatures and stuff like that?
Yeah. Um, yes and no. I mean, I think they're very focused on known threats, but that's what they do, and I think yeah, I think in some ways the industry as a whole is too focused on unknown threats. I guess I would say, and not too
Mm,
focused. That might not be the right word, but they're sexier. Those are the funner ones, like the 0-day dropping that's gonna compromise
right.
everyone. But really, what all the breaches that are happening are 8-year-old versions of software that people forgot to update. The breaches aren't from
Mhm.
these 0 days that black swan events that hit the whole industry. So you can talk about those, you can think about those, you can worry about them. They're more fun.
Right.
But really, the doing your homework, eating your vegetables, updating the old software is what's going to keep you safe and breach free.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. Interesting. So before I let you do the parting words, because that's always a guest that do the parting
Oh man,
words, I'm going to remind everybody of who the next guest is. And so next Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern, we have Pritesh Patel the CEO of Ad Hoc Research, who is an expert in modeling and simulation and digital twin. And we're going to debunk, or at least take a deep dive in digital engineering and how to effectively have a digital representation of your models, of your systems, before you even bend metal, to see how they're going to behave. And we're going to also look at it as a weapon system level of complexity, and how to implement this, how not to get locked into to these modeling solutions, and what's the modern way, a more cloud native way on top of Kubernetes, to run some of these modeling capabilities. And so that's going to be an interesting conversation for hardware software combos. So that's going to be next Tuesday, 1 p.m. And we're so lucky to have you. Wanted to thank you again. Thank you for all the stuff you've done to make our country and really the open source ecosystem safer. Without people like you, I think we'll be in a much worse spot. So I wanted to thank you and tell everybody to go check ChainGuard.dev, and also see all of the capabilities you're bringing to life. With that, we're gonna let you say your parting words, and wanted to thank you again.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. I don't have anything prepared here, but yeah, I'll just kind of yeah, I'll just wing it, and I'll just reinforce the we talk a lot about open source security. It's open source is here to stay. It's not even a productive conversation to have about whether we should get rid of it. It's there. It's not going anywhere. So I like to focus it the other way and just figure out how to improve it, how to make it better, and how to make it safer to use. Rewriting everything for the next 50 years is a non-starter. So yeah, thanks for having me, Nick.
No doubt. Yeah, thanks for joining. And again, everybody, thanks for joining. We'll see you next Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern, to talk about all this digital engineering cool stuff. And in the meantime, keep up the good work, and keep up so we can make sure our kids have a fighting chance at winning against China 20 years from now. Stay safe, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks.